Hi there, and welcome to Unprompted, where we speak with the voices shaping the future of conversational AI. And today's guest is none other than Greg Bennett. He really brings a unique lens to conversation design. He's blending social linguistics, enterprise bot design, and now multilingual Gen AI strategy in Japan. So he's previously led conversation design at Salesforce and helped define its enterprise voice strategy, now based in Tokyo and head of prompt engineering at ZEALS. He's really pioneering prompt design in one of the world's most linguistically nuanced markets. With roots in discourse analysis and interactional social linguistic, Greg brings both rigor and empathy to his approach. We're going to talk about the evolution from designer to prompt engineer, the rise of Japanese LLMs, the declarative versus generative AI debate, and the cultural and regulatory forces shaping the future of AI. And for me personally, I always want to say, Greg, I learned so much from you. And I'll never forget one conversation that we once had in San Francisco where you opened my eyes into a world of social linguistics and empathy and human centricity. So it's great to see you after basically a long time. We just talked about it's been a while. And
Yeah, likewise. It's great to see you too, Hans. Thanks for having me.
you've been around for quite a while. What do you feel is something that's completely true about conversational AI that you believe is 100% true that very few people agree with you on, or that very few people understand, perhaps?
I think the thing that I've always held true about conversation as when you look at it from a data perspective, a lot of times I hear people in the industry say that conversation is unstructured data. And when I think about it from a data science perspective, I can understand why people say that. But as a linguist, that's the part where I completely disagree, because conversation has form, it has structure. There's at least 50 years worth of research that shows that conversations follow a particular pattern. I think that oftentimes, because we're human and we think that because we're able to have conversation and we don't have to overthink strategically too much in everyday conversation to engage and have that kind of interaction, that it's this sort of squishy, fluid thing that we kind of just feel our way through. And I think that conversation is a lot more strategic than that. It requires a lot more thought and effort than I think we give ourselves credit for. That there's order and structure, and that it's easy to cause confusion and requires actually a considerable amount of effort to clarify that confusion. I think those kinds of things kind of show that conversation inherently has structure, and there's research from many linguists out there to show that the structure itself holds true across different languages and cultures.
Yeah, and as you're saying these things now, what's going through my head is like, yes, I could now. I have infinite things that I can say, but it would feel very uncomfortable for me to say very strange things right now. And I think like the more I've been doing this, like the first thing you Google conversations are stuff like corporative principle comes up, right? It's like this, oh, like, it's one of those things. And the more I understand about it, the more I see actually how important that is or how valuable the engine of communication. And now, I guess then, as you've transitioned from, you've seen coming from linguistics, going into conversation design at one of the biggest brands you were part of, when Slack was acquired, figuring out, can you reinvent that whole product from a conversational lens? Coming from that world and now prompt engineering, what then has stayed the same also from this perspective, and what is completely different then? Because you might have take that same frame of reference.
Totally. I think the thing that's the same for me is the interaction design piece. Um, because I sat in a UX team for so long, the way that I kind of, and because my, academic training is in interactional sociolinguistics. So how do people use language and conversation and interaction? I always think backwards from the interactional goal. So, what are we trying to achieve with the other person in the interaction? If you're only thinking about yourself in conversation, and the conversation isn't necessarily going to go anywhere, um, it's really, I think it might have been Frederick Erickson who said this, a prominent linguist in the field, that having a conversation is like climbing a tree that climbs back. It's not a one one-sided thing. Conversation is a partnership, and to some degree, a negotiation. And so, if we're thinking about that and trying to design an experience that is fundamentally conversation or mediated through conversation, we have to think about, okay, what are these two speakers trying to achieve together? As a business, I may be trying to achieve a sale. I may be trying to sell this person something. But the user, they're probably either maybe they're trying to learn more information, maybe they're trying to accomplish a purchase. It really helps to be clear on what the goal of the interaction is on each side and then figure out how to get there. Especially when, for us in tech, we're often designing conversation on behalf of an institution. That institution has its own goals and motivations. For profit-based institutions, they're going to want to ideally get money from the customer. So how do you do that in a way that both helps the customer fulfill their needs and retains their loyalty, ideally? So all that said is, I think that piece is fundamentally the same in prompt engineering. If you're not clear with the LLM, what is the goal of this interaction? Then it's not gonna be as strong of a fit for the experience as, one might assume. I think a lot of people think about prompt engineering and think, "Okay, I'm gonna just tell this thing, 'Hey, I want you to be charismatic,' or 'Hey, I want you to be like Steve Jobs.'" That's great. What is the charismatic person trying to do? What is Steve Jobs trying to do? Is because Steve Jobs was a lot of things to a lot of different people. Was Steve Jobs is he playing a leader? Is he playing a salesperson? Is he playing a technologist? And it's really important, I think, to be clear with the LLM about what that goal is. The way I see this as similar to traditional conversation design is that a lot of times I would have these kinds of conversations with my direct reports and an individual conversation designer and say, okay, what are you really trying to achieve here? Because that's going to clarify a lot of how you design the conversation. Now, I do that with an LLM. And the interesting thing about that is that I don't have the luxury of being able to go back and forth with the LLM when the prompt itself lives in the back end and it sets the stage for all the rest of the interaction that's supposed to happen on behalf of the customer that I'm representing. So in some ways, it's kind of harder because I have to be as thorough as I can without making the prompt too bulky and without constraining the model too much such that it can't leverage its randomness or what people like to call creativity, that gives that sort of delight in terms of the experience. So that's what I would consider to be the slight difference.
Yeah, we're basically saying in these interaction, I think that is the core. It's like if you look at Joseph Campbell, it is like a hero's journey. It's like somebody sets out on a certain task. It's the customer, but it's also the LLM. They both have their own worlds. They're call to adventure. We reach out, and basically, we get we have conflicting goals. Therefore, we get tension, and the designer's task is to sort of, remove that tension so that both can transform and complete their goal. And I think this is where, in movies and TV shows where dialogue is flat, it's because there's not a clear intention from both characters and there's no transformation of that character. And to me, it seems like, if you in the old world, if you would where you had control, you might, if you look at the interaction, you want to draw a triangle, you draw three lines. That's declarative. Now, if you're doing agentic experience design, you're drawing three dots and you allow the triangle to emerge from the large language model. That's almost like, it's the rigorous design and control versus, letting it emerge through the anchors that you've put in your design almost. But the concept is the same. If you don't have a clear intention, it goes flat. It goes nowhere. Like if you don't have a goal, you can't hit it. That's the core thing. So then what's something that people like us that have been doing this for a while, what do we need to like really unlearn as far as you're concerned?
Unlearn. It's interesting because I think I don't I don't know if unlearn is the word that I would use as much as the thing that sort of stands out to me about your question is for people who've been doing this for a long time. I've been doing this for 10 plus years now. And the thing that I often keep challenging myself to not um, be too reactive towards is when people don't know the back history or the work that has been done up until now. And so I don't know if it's necessarily that I would unlearn something, but really more like challenge myself and other people like myself. Like, hey, part of your job now, having been in the field for 10 or more years, is accepting the fact that you're going to have to repeat yourself a lot. It's kind of like when you're a recording artist and you've been in the recording industry for a long time, you're like, "Hey, I'm Madonna and I'm tired of singing Vogue." Lady, that's one of your biggest hits. So you get on the stage and you sing Vogue. You know, she's tired of it because she's sung it a million times, but I'm in the audience. I'm new to her concert. I want to hear Vogue for the first time in my life. And so that's a thing that I keep kind of reminding myself and other people who have been in the field for a while, in the industry for a while, is like, it's not out of maliciousness that someone who is new to the field, they may not necessarily be new from a technological perspective. They've been a technologist for a while, but they're new to the world of LLMs, or maybe they're a fresh grad out of college. Either way, I don't like to hold what they don't know against them. And so the thing that I try to remind people who've been in the field for a while is like, take a deep breath and be prepared to repeat yourself because that's part of your role now, as like a senior level person. And I think for people who are new, the thing that I like to kind of share with them is I'm like, there's actually a lot of stuff that's happened before. And just because we're traversing new territory doesn't mean that the problems themselves are completely new.
Yeah. There's sometimes this tension that I experience between what's legacy and what's wisdom. And sometimes, because now you got people entering the industry with so much confidence and but they're sometimes it's like, yeah, it's new and it's different and it works. And sometimes they're just making the same mistakes. It's basically, you got builders and you have poets and they together built, one builds the infrastructure and the other gives it soul and meaning and lets people want to interact with it. And yeah, LLMs don't solve that overnight. So that, yeah, so I find that that's into I like how you say that. Yeah, we were gonna be repeating ourselves a lot without being arrogant about it, without taking so
Exactly.
you need to be humble enough to have the same you need to yeah, you need to lean into your wisdom, but also be humble and open for new ideas and
Yeah.
basically reinvent those old ideas in this new context. The when I think about declarative, like to me, it seems I had this thought the other day. It's like when you had NLU design, basically, it was there's only so many levers that you had, and basically, language you could fully control what the system would say, and it was highly underutilized by brands to have impactful conversational AI. So it was a very clear lever that we as conversation designers could control and determine the success of a chatbot. Now, when we think about agentic experience design, there's more levers. We have less control, there's more levers, and sometimes you wanna really lean into, the language lever of the output of system, but you can't fully control it, and there are now also new levers. So some of that wisdom and knowledge applies there, and some of that is probably not as relevant as much anymore, but it's all starts from a human-centered perspective nonetheless.
100% agree. Yes.
Wow, that's easy. Yeah, so now oh, yeah, we're done here, people. So now, I mean, you now, I know you wanted to go to Tokyo for a long time. You're finally there now. You're dealing with Japanese large language models, which I guess don't speak in characters, do they? That's all of a sudden I'm realizing what is I guess they do, right?
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, tell me some of those like differences maybe in that Japanese context where I guess communication is also very different in general. So there's a cultural element there too.
Yeah, for sure. The cultural element in particular is really interesting because at ZEALS, where I currently work, we use right now in production, we use models from overseas, OpenAI, for example. Those models are, traditionally trained in Romance languages, particularly like English, Spanish, French, etc. So the linguistic structure of how you convey importance and uh, you can kind of give a sense of priority in those languages is quite different than how you do it in Japanese. And so in figuring out how to convey importance to the large language model within a large system prompt of like, hey, I have all these instructions, and here are the ones that are absolutely, under no circumstances are you allowed to not abide by these instructions. And then these instructions are important, but if you don't get to them, that's fine. And then here's some other stuff that's good to know. Um, that the way that I do that in English versus how I do it in Japanese, I'm still working with native Japanese speakers to figure out what the best way of doing that in Japanese looks like. And so what that means is the challenge with working with overseas models is one, a great deal of the prompt is going to have to be based in English because that's what's going to be the strongest and most effective and cost effective. Because when we think from a token perspective, there's fewer tokens that you would use when you're doing the prompt in English versus when you would do it in Japanese. That's one thing. But then figuring out how to communicate certain pieces of the prompt that are inherently culturally Japanese, um, sometimes those need to be in Japanese rather than in English. So a really good example that I like to share is around what in linguistics we call register, or I think maybe colloquially people like to call formality. In English, we kind of have things like this where you address people by, madam or sir, or you can use like things like, may I ask for a glass of water or things like that, something that's a little bit more of a refined way of speaking. In Japanese, there are these very clear levels of politeness or register, and asking a large language model to abide by a certain degree of politeness in English, it's been very difficult to try and get that to stick. So that's actually a piece that I actually just did a training with a bunch of our conversation designers yesterday about how if you're going to try and modify the politeness piece, that part is gonna probably have to be modified in Japanese. That's where I've experienced the strongest kind of, results. So, certain cultural aspects with overseas models, I think, those parts have to be in Japanese. We don't yet use Japanese large language models on production, but in the experimentation I've done with Japanese large language models, a lot of the prompting can easily be done in Japanese, but the way that I would convey things like importance and like degree of priority within the prompt, it's just going to be linguistically different than how I do it in English. So the part that I find, I guess, maybe the most interesting with Japanese, I haven't used a ton, but of the ones that I have used, the interesting thing that I'm noticing is that there has to be something under the hood in terms of how it was trained that involves a Western language, because there are certain tactics that I've taken in Japanese to convey importance. Like there's different ways of saying you need to or should do something. In English, we have modal verbs, must, should, could, that conveys a degree of importance in that must is like, okay, if you don't do this, it's an absolute like you've violated the laws of the world or whatever. In Japanese, they don't have modal verbs like that. So there's different kinds of inflections they can use in the verb conjugation to try and do it. I have yet to figure out if that's exactly the strongest way to convey importance in Japanese linguistically. Um, that's the closest I can get, but because that actual syntactic, morphosyntactic piece does not exist in Japanese, trying to figure out a different way of conveying that degree of importance or vitality is just a much more interesting challenge. So those would be what I consider the biggest differences.
So then there are elements in the language itself that don't exist, but then the large language model underneath also seems to be trained on a different language. There's some English in the data, so you're dealing with the same problem on two levels. That makes it incredibly difficult to control.
Difficult to control, but also difficult to kind of anticipate which, like you had mentioned, we have all these different kinds of levers that we can pull as conversation designers. I often think of language as, okay, which lever am I going to pull to achieve this thing in the interaction, from the linguistics perspective. And so when I think about how to do that in English, I'm like, okay, I want to make this super important. I'm going to pull the modal verb lever and use should because this is stronger than you may or you might, but not as strong as you must, and, kind of separate things in that way. In Japanese, I'm still trying to think of like, okay, there are levers that I can pull. I could say, kore yari nasai, which is like kind of like saying you need to do this, but it's like a more polite or like motherly type. There's association with it. There's a maternal, a parental association with the way that you say that. You could say yare, which is like do this in Japanese. But there's like, 100 other ways you could do it. And so figuring out which way is going to give me the greatest degree, like you said, of control. It's been surprising in working with Japanese large language models because the extent to which that's effective tells me a little bit about how much other language data are being used underneath the hood and maybe what types of data are potentially being used to train the model in the first place. Because you were talking about NLU earlier. If it's not being trained on actual turn-based conversation, and instead the way that the model is anticipating the next, you know, word or character in the syntax is based on, you know, like articles, like written form, like newspaper articles or Yelp review type of discourse. It's just a different type of interaction.
Yeah, you get a very different thing. Yeah, if you train it on James Joyce, for example, Ulysses, you got a very different conversation than when you train it on your own WhatsApp conversation. That's basically
Exactly, exactly. So, the kinds of exposition, the different levers that I'd pull, it's kind of like I said, climbing a tree that climbs back, trying to figure out, "Okay, what do you know, and how do you know it, and then how can I pull the right lever to get you to do what I want you to do?"
And is second government supported initiatives is does that have to do with some of these linguistic challenges, or does it have to do more with autonomy from maybe large tech vendors? What's driving that investment there or commitment to it?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both. So I think about a month ago, I was involved in the Global Partnership on AI's Innovation Summit here in Tokyo, and it was hosted by the Japanese branch of the government called the National Institute of Communication and Technology. So I got to get a little bit more perspective from the government side of things on why there's a need for generative AI. And, you'd mentioned this, I think, previously, the idea that a lot of this is about, Japan as a society has a bit of a resource issue in terms of labor. So how do we scale the workforce and the labor force using something like generative AI? That's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to work on generative AI here, because in Silicon Valley, a lot of the discourse around, using and developing on generative AI is about, okay, how can we beat this rival in the tech arena, as opposed to what are we going to use this thing for? There's a lot of discourse about AGI and this, sort of amorphous, fantastic future, but how is it fantastic and for whom? And how is fantastic different than what the deficits are now? There's not a lot of nuanced discussion about that in Silicon Valley, but in Japan, it's very much about how do we apply this. So if we're going to use a large language model, and we're going to host data, you know, of our citizens, in a custom instance, for example, of the model for the Japanese public. Does that need to live on premises in Japan? Is it legally okay to have that overseas? What are the, sort of privacy and data regulation risks around that? So I think that's one thing that's motivating the development of Japanese large language models. I think another piece of it is, like you'd also alluded to, the linguistic inherent linguistic differences between Japanese as a language compared to the sort of structural linguistics of Western languages is another big one. I think another piece of it also is that there's, I think, a big push in Japan, particularly in Tokyo right now, around just innovation. How can we make things better? I think, it's weird, I think, to use this example, but I like to use it because it's so visceral. I think there's something about Japan culturally about taking something that's always existed and making it the best that it could potentially be. And the example I like to use is the toilet seat, which is, I know, kind of odd, but Japanese toilet seats are like the best in the world because the bidet as a technology has existed for thousands of years, but the Japanese perfected it where now you have a spa for your bum. I think that concept of taking something that has existed forever, like conversation, and making it the best that it could possibly be using whatever technology you have available to you, I think that's very core to, what I've experienced of Japan and what makes me excited to work on generative AI here. And so I think based on that, companies like Sakana AI, they're taking these just incredible approaches to LLM and generative AI development, a kind of approach that is just totally different from my background. So, Sakana AI, in particular, their approach has more to do with ecological, evolutionary, biological type of patterns, which is so different than language-based approaches, where I was just reading about they have, a basically a how do I put this? I wouldn't call it a framework, but their technological approach, they have a technological approach that they've called the continuous thought machine, which has a lot to do with things like evolution and thinking about the previous context and including that in the next step that it takes, and introducing time as an element around decision making and logic, which I think is fascinating. And I never would have thought of anything like that in my life, given my background. So I think it's very inspiring that the Japanese government is willing to invest in these different types of approaches.
Do you think that comes from just the time horizon that Japan, like that we have shops that are 500 years old, like yeah, they take their time. It's like it's about doing things very properly. It's basically Apple as a company on steroids of like how everything that's being built. You kind of see that reflected now in AI development, almost like just a little bit maybe of a quieter long-term thinking about it, not being disturbed too much about what's happening in the outside worlds.
Yeah, I think the idea of looking at AI as a tool or a resource rather than a weapon. So a lot of the discourse I hear in in Silicon Valley is around who are we going to topple, who are we going to beat? And in Japan, it's like, how are we gonna farm better? How are we going to improve our garbage waste collection? How are we going to improve hotel reservations? How are we going to make it so that way the elderly who are off in, the countryside are less lonely? Those kinds of things that I'm like, "Okay, they're starting," and maybe that's because inherently I've always been kind of an applied researcher. Let's start from a real world problem and then work backwards from that. And sometimes generative AI is the right solution for it, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes you can use something declarative and solve that problem, but that the issue that we're trying to solve is not inherently, oh, we're trying to do something with AI. Rather than finding a tool for the nail, we're gonna start with a nail and then pick a
Yeah.
hammer.
Seems how you're talking about it is that there's a weapon versus a resource. Also something that this is going to be here for a very long time. So what do we want our relationship to be with it? So that's like it's deeply philosophical and cultural of even like what are we doing here and why are we doing it and what does it mean to us and the future of Japan, perhaps. Maybe I'm reading too much into it now.
No, I think I honestly, like, as soon as you said that, I'm like, yeah, that resonates because, I had who was I talking to recently about this? Um My favorite cafe in Tokyo, they're a very kind of like I don't think they intend to be retro. I think they're just retro because they've been around for 40 years. But there's a very kind of like 80s vibe to it, 80s, 90s vibe to it, and I absolutely love it. Cash only, no internet, like lovely, lovely cafe. And I was talking with the owner and, he asked me what I do for work. I said I work in AI and he's like, "Oh, that's gonna be a really important part of our lives from now on." And that's the thing that I thought of when you said that, is that there's this idea that kind of like thinking about like, oh, like electricity. It's not who am I going to defeat with the fact that I've got electricity and who's going to make the best kind of power grid and more just like, oh, how are we going to improve our lives with this new technological development? And that just feels really refreshing.
Yeah, I think it's still on this topic a little bit. Like, I know that in NLU world, you were quite passionate about having sort of minority languages or maybe dialects and stuff be included. Ebonics was very important for you. It's like a sort of like this is part of people's identity. Basically, if not everybody speaks perfect English, so if your English is slightly different, an NLU system wouldn't understand you, and basically your identity is rejected. And that
Gosh, you remember so well.
I've told that story many times. And I was actually I learned that when we started the episode with while we were having coffee once at the Salesforce office in the garden there. Do you see that similar dynamic? I mean, we kind of touched on it with, the linguistics being different, but do you also see it at the level of dialects, minorities, maybe particularly in Japan, that need to be included in these data sets and that they might also have a different approach to that?
So there's, I think, a few layers to that. I think the first piece that stands out is to me is going back to maybe why I was so particular about it before, like you mentioned, is okay, the NLU is not going to be able to recognize this dialect if we don't prepare it in advance, or this variant of a language. So if you have a speaker of African American vernacular English and it doesn't understand, it's almost like you've erased that entire population. Now I'll see, like, whether it's on Twitter or different kinds of social media where there's a generative AI component to it, and people will speak or communicate with that LLM in their native dialect. The NLU piece, the understanding of what the user has communicated, doesn't seem to have been degraded. It doesn't seem like there's any issue in understanding what the user has said, even though the dialect or variant of the language is different. So I don't know necessarily that the original concern that I had maybe 5, 6 years ago is as much of a concern now, in the sense that, oh, these languages underrepresented? And is it keeping people from being able to use the technology? I think now what we're looking at is less of a usability issue and more of kind of like an access issue. So when I was at the innovation workshop in Tokyo, a big theme there was what was called the Global South. And that was actually the first time I'd ever heard that term. But it referred to countries in the world that have less access and less resources and means to be able to, attain usage of an LLM. So we have countries like Egypt, who I believe the government opened a contract directly with OpenAI, so all of their citizens can use ChatGPT, a subscription license with zero charge to them as a citizen. Yeah, not every country is going to be able to do that. And so, what about the countries who maybe struggle with Wi-Fi access or struggle with consistent electricity? If their electricity goes out on a regular basis, it's going to inherently kind of put those countries at a disadvantage when it comes to LLM and technological development. I think that's really more the direction that it's going in now rather than, oh, is the LLM going to be able to understand this person because they speak a slightly different dialect? I think with underrepresented languages as a whole, so like within Japan, for example, the native population of Japan, known as the Ainu, who are from up north, have their own Ainu language. Is a Japanese large language model going to be able to understand Ainu? I haven't had any direct experience with that because I don't know Ainu, but I did speak to a researcher at the NICT who did work and experiment on something exactly like that, where he could basically build a large language model that would allow for understanding of Ainu, which is great. So the usability issue is gone, but now the issue that arises is less around, the UX of it and more around the ethics and the policy around it. So as a native population in Japan, does that population consent to having their language replicated or having the LLM trained on that language? And it becomes an issue with endangered languages or with underrepresented languages in particular because, you know, does it seem to some degree kind of a type of colonialism where you're just taking from that language or that population for the sake of being able to make the LLM perform in that language? Now, the upside to that is things like language preservation. So, for underrepresented languages where they're slowly potentially dying or going out, that having an LLM that can produce that language and understand and converse in that language is helpful to kind of maybe revitalize the language. But without the consent piece, then there's a certain kind of imperialist type flavor to it that I think is a really complicated thing that governments and different institutions have to think through. One of the topics that came up at the innovation workshop about a month ago was around how do we kind of codify these languages and cultures as institutions so that way they have the right to say, I want to be included or excluded, which I think is kind of akin similar to GDPR in Europe, for example. Um, Canada, for example, their native populations, the First Nations, I believe, are have legal institutions. So they can go to court and on behalf of their language and culture say we do want to participate or do not. But I don't think every country has that. So it's a new, more complex
It's interesting because you could also like they might have the institutions, but you can probably it's not that difficult to make arguments against those institutions,
Yes.
like who owns a language. Yeah, exactly. I grew up Frisian, then Dutch, and I speak English. Like I do not feel like I have any say in the preservation of English. But then Frisian, I don't I don't know.
Yeah.
Like it's quite my mom was not Frisian, my dad, but like it's yeah, so
You hit the nail on the head.
that's not something yeah, it's kinda like, one language, one people, one country. No, 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 that's like you feel the complexity pretty
Yes.
quickly. I'm just gonna go back to, like, the process for auditing prompts or reviewing these LLM conversations over time, because we kinda talk about, what does the LLM do? How do we look at it? What do we want it to do in terms of goals? How do we then now make sure that we, have proper governance around that and make sure it's doing what we want it to do?
It's a tough challenge, especially because the model providers themselves are constantly pushing updates to their models. So I think anyone who works on prompt engineering has run into an experience where the prompt that they made yesterday, an hour from now or tomorrow is not working like it did yesterday. Which I think on one hand, it's very exciting. On another hand, it's also kind of challenging because for me personally, I'm kind of like, okay, well, if this thing that I made yesterday and it worked yesterday no longer works, did I even really do anything? So there's a bit of that kind of like uh loss.
Wild, but
Oh
it's
yeah.
just like Oscar Wilde's like, well, it's like, what did you do? What did you? I had a very busy day. Yeah, in the morning I added a comma. In the
Yes.
afternoon I removed
Yes,
it.
exactly. Or like, I mean, I've been more into Dostoevsky these days, so that tells you a little bit about where my mind is with prompt engineering. But I think the benchmark it. And so I think the things that are always going to be constant are like we had talked about earlier, okay, what's the final goal of what this interaction is supposed to be? And what is the shape of success? So if the final goal is to sell the person an item, and that's what the business is making money off of or how they're being evaluated, then irrespective of how the model has changed or how you change the prompt, did it actually sell? Yes or no? If you cross that threshold, then to that degree, that piece of the prompt still works. Um, Certain controls around stylistics or conversational style, like emoji in Japanese, you have the register around heigo, the kinds of character usage. So in Japanese, there's 4 different writing systems. So, and there are very particular guidelines from certain companies about which kinds of writing should be used in which contexts. Um, did it follow those things? Does it still follow those things? And so I think it's important to create basically a rubric or a scorecard of some kind to consistently evaluate those points against. Okay, prompt has changed, or the model has changed, or both. Run the prompt against these types of inputs, and does it still succeed across these types of evaluations? That's the way that we approach it, and how I've set things up at ZEALS.
And then you do that in a test environment rather than real time as governance, kind of where you.
I mean, well, ideally, I think, I think a little bit of both. There are people I think who test in production just because I think there are a lot of people who like to live on the edge, and I commend people like that. I am not one of those people. I like to test in developer orgs. But I think it's important, like you said, to have, sort of ongoing maintenance and observation that goes on in production as it goes. And so I think those kinds of metrics a gatekeeper will also just like, your regular sort of bread and butter type of product telemetry. Is this thing still working in production? We can tell if the API call failed or if if you weren't able to connect to your server using MCP. Those kinds of things we have as, very sort of binary metric around did it work, did it not? But did this thing make a sale? Did this thing follow the right emoji instructions? I think it is important to be able to observe that in real time because for different countries and different markets that those have different levels of severity. So for example, in Japan, if you have not used the right kind of language or whatever, the customer will pick up immediately and it's going to affect your brand. I think that is the case pretty much in any market, but in Japan in particular, they're very, very sensitive to that kind of mismatch with the marketing. And if your marketing doesn't follow your product, there's actual, regulatory punishments that can be incurred by the company itself. So the stakes are a lot higher.
And if you look at did we make this sale, or it almost becomes like direct sale versus long-term value and brand perception. I guess brand perception could be translated to lifetime customer value. So you put the LLM almost in a prisoner's dilemma of like, am I going to go for this sale now, but it's gonna long term not give me the best outcome versus actually I'm going to back off here, stay true to brand, knowing that I'll get a bigger chunk down the line, right? So it puts it in a prisoner's dilemma where it's either I get nothing now or I might risk everything long term. Like it because we've done an experiment like that with a big Asian super app that's doing a similar thing too. It's like first figuring out like what are the boosters, barriers, and information needs for people in this sales journey, then using that information as we basically negotiate and pitch a product to them, but then also considering almost like the prisoner's dilemma of like, do I want to go to for a sale now? And if I push too hard, I might actually lose this customer altogether versus soften it. So if you want to measure the outcome, because what you're then saying is like, did we make the sale? It's like, yeah, you may have made the sale, but may have cost you a customer. Like that. So the simpler, yeah. So it's not as simple as that even then.
No, it's not, and I think that goes back to kind of getting really clear about, okay, so what's your ultimate goal? Is your ultimate goal a quick sale or retainment? And I think that, even outside of just conversational goals, conversation design, and prompt engineering, I think there isn't as much rigor or clarity around what that final goal for the business is, just in general business practice. Um, that there's a little bit more of this reactive nature to things like sales, that, the nuance that you're conveying, I think is an important thing that maybe has been lost a little bit.
And then, if we look at, regulation, generative versus declarative, you're basically saying like Japanese are quite sensitive to these brand risks. There's new guidelines. It seems like people are quite keen to follow rules there. In general, declarative versus generative. What kind of some of the things that stand out to you there?
Always been a fan of let's use the right tool for the right problem. So I always really like a hybrid approach. For certain things, I think declarative is the way to go, not just from a security perspective, but from a cost perspective. So, for example, like having the LLM constantly respond with a fallback message. That's so, I mean, I think that's kind of a way, if you're using the same fallback message and you're asking the LLM to produce the same fallback message, then you're basically wasting the API call. And that's just from a business perspective. The part of me that's just like a citizen of the world is I'm like, wait a second, you're going to waste a bottle of water because you want to send the same message? We could just like pull that from the code. It would be faster, it would be cheaper, and we would not be wasting a bottle of water. So there's that aspect to it. I think the other aspect to it is that depending on the use case for, the industry, frankly, with Japanese customers, they may not have the regulatory room for what a lot of people consider to be an LLM's creativity. If the LLM is not 100% correct, in industries like health and life science or financial services, then the punishment or the risk for the company to incur punishment is so high that they're not willing to do it. Exactly. And so at that point, that's when I'm kind of like, well, then you offer them a, you know, declarative bot, or you figure out within their business which parts are the highly regulated pieces. And those parts are the declarative bot. And then the other parts that maybe aren't as heavily regulated, that's the part that can benefit from a little bit more creativity. So I think an example would be like, if it's has less to do with what do you call this? Like a product or service that the, company is providing, and more around FAQ around, let's say, like, the history of the company and how long they've been around or where their offices are located. I feel like that has a far less risk in terms of regulation, that you could use an LLM for that. Now, what's the benefit? And in terms of the cost that you're paying, does it make sense to do that? Probably not, if you've already gone to the extent of building a declarative bot for the entire knowledge base. But those are the kinds of, I think, creative ways to think about having a hybrid approach that I would at least encourage businesses to think about.
Yeah, the way I see it is like topics, it goes from simple to complex, and it's grounded in generic or in sensitive information. So when it's simple and grounded in generic information, that's where LLMs can have a field day. And then as it gets more complex and more sensitive, that's basically where you want to have more control in declarative. And then if it's very sensitive, very complex, it's probably going to go to a human. And then based on your industry and your risk tolerance and the cost of getting it wrong, you basically decide, you know, what the division is of labor between those three approaches.
And whether or not it's worth the risk, for example. I think that's honestly the biggest, kind of discussion point I have with Japanese customers in particular is, okay, if this is highly, highly regulated, where if you are talking about a coupon and you get the information about the coupon wrong, that the risk for that could, ruin your business, then I think an LLM is out of the question, even though, coupon information that falls within the box of, it's simple and it's not, this sort of overly complex information. But if I think the thing that I often have to communicate to people, if we go back to what we were saying earlier about, oh, you have to repeat yourself a lot in this role, the thing I often have to repeat to people is I'm like, with generative AI, we can never guarantee 100%. We can only tell you that it works a certain amount of the time, but it's never a complete guarantee. It's not perfect. And so there's always that chance. And unless you're comfortable with that risk, then I can't in good faith suggest this as a solution to you.
Yeah, and I mean, if you got a million customers, then being right 99.999% of the time is in absolute still numbers, still hundreds of people that get it wrong,
Exactly.
right? And
Yes.
think that so the bigger your brand, the more
Yes.
in absolute numbers that risk is there, which is difficult to do. I mean, there's people building those solutions for that and stuff, but I guess
Yeah.
going from bigger brands to smaller brands, going from an enterprise from
Yes.
Salesforce, that big Salesforce, to
Yeah.
ZEALS, to a startup, which I guess it's not startup-y, but because you said, you got a team of designers, so it is significant. But, like, what has surprised you about that shift from types of organization? What do you wish that maybe, organizations larger organizations could learn from the smaller ones?
Yeah. I think the thing that surprised me the most was how similar they are in terms of internal operations. That I mean, even in a large company, the direction can change quickly and a lot and without as much warning. And even within a startup, there can be directives from the top in terms of, okay, we're going to do this. And so those are the things that I found to be surprisingly similar, where I was like, okay, I changed countries, I changed company sizes, and ooh, we still have this challenge. So maybe this is just what it means to work in a company that you have these kinds of, these sorts of, challenges in both areas. I think the thing that large companies could benefit learning from startups, at least in my experience at ZEALS, we have a big practice and culture around hiring new grads. So this very fresh talent with very, um, contemporary views on the technology. To some degree, they've been using it already because they were still in college when ChatGPT came out. So their willingness to not just experiment, but also think creatively and out of the box, I find it to just be really fascinating. And so that's something that I think that, large companies, there are internship programs, but I think that can move a little slowly. Hiring new grads fresh out of college with, no work experience is always, sure, a risk. But I think it's something that does help SEALs quite a bit, because we get people who are just contemporary. They're on the cutting edge. And I think that's something that, large companies could benefit a great deal from.
What we looked at is like, is it an evolution or is it a paradigm shift? Like, and I think, culturally, it's almost like a epistemic breach in Foucault of like going from the Ages to Enlightenment. That's the kind of shift we're going to see looking back at this hundreds of years from now. But was it a paradigm shift versus an evolution? And it seems like it is a paradigm shift. Therefore, it makes sense to bring in people that do not have what we talked about earlier, legacy versus wisdom, that don't carry that, but just, it's the same. Like my son, is 3.5 years old, but Bitcoin is just as old to him as gold is.
Exactly, yes.
So he doesn't carry the legacy of that. So that makes a lot of sense in terms of like it is officially a paradigm shift. Therefore, bring in new people that grew up in a paradigm and do not get blinded by a legacy perspective that is incredibly difficult to
I
change.
think that and maybe the part about it that I think, is particular to, like, the Japanese perspective is also how do you retain the best parts of your past or the strongest parts of your past while also keeping an eye toward the future and moving forward? Because I mean, when I think, about Japanese history and you think back to like the Meiji Restoration, for example, that's precisely what they did. They were like, okay, we're going to make our debut on the global stage. So we're going to send our citizens out to different parts of the world and find the best things and bring it back to Japan and then update the country in a particular way without losing these core qualities about what it means to be Japanese, historically. And I think that's the thing that I think about, like at ZEALS, for example. Okay, we're not gonna just throw out the thing that made ZEALs strong, which is declarative chat. I don't think it makes sense. It's not the right move from a business perspective, and while it's not the sexiest thing that's going to make headlines, it is the thing that sells. And particularly, there are situations in which it is actually the best solution. And I think that's the important thing that ZEALs has sort of kept, is, okay, what is the part of our past that we keep? And how do we kind of infuse that with people who are on the bleeding edge of the future? And I think that's something that I appreciate just about working in generative AI in Tokyo as a whole is that one foot in, what exists, the present, and even a little bit from the past. I think that's not something that I hear too much or experience too much in Silicon Valley anymore. It's so much about this future and that the past or the present is somehow just inefficient or insufficient. And I'm kind of like, if you throw out everything from the past, then it's almost like you're starting over. We're kind of reinventing the wheel, and that's not the best use of time and resources either. So I like having the mix of both.
Yeah, most people that flee their past have an identity crisis down the line somewhere in their lives. And I guess in Silicon Valley,
I always enjoy talking to
uh,
you, Hans.
in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of job hopping. We
Yes.
basically go to whatever gives us the best stock options.
Mhm.
Does Japan in Gen AI create its new salaryman that will stick with a company and basically become that
Yeah.
LLM that is being tuned to that brand? If you bring in these young linguists now into ZEALs that are going to stay there for 40 years, their entire careers, they become that LLM at one point. Like, what do you think is happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's this sort of like interconnection of the fact that there's, the development around LLM and generative AI technology is a little bit more fast paced. And so there's that movement a little bit more that I think could be shifting that a bit. That is also coupled with the fact that Gen Z in Japan thinks just very differently from, like my generation, like the, Heisei millennial type, or even the Showa period folks, which like the first thing that surprised me when I started working at ZEALS wasn't necessarily the culture shock of working for a Japanese company, but more the culture shock of working with Gen Z Japanese folks who don't want you to use polite keigo in the office. And I did that in the beginning and they were like, "Oh yeah, it's kinda cold and, sort of stiff and formal." And I'm like, "Wait, really? Because back in my day, if I didn't talk like this, I was rude as hell," you know? So, that kind of difference, I think, and this talk about, this real push for work-life balance, particularly in Tokyo, like, it was wild. I was in a train station and saw a sign that was from the Tokyo metropolitan government that said, "Let's take a break. Let's rest. Let's take care of ourselves." And I'm like, yeah, I would never have expected to see anything like that from the Tokyo metropolitan government 10, 20 years ago. And I think it's because there's this focus on the fact that Japan is an island country and has limited resources in terms of population. So, how do we make the most of what is here? And if you have people who are working themselves to death, that's not going to work. And so, I think that, at least from my experience in working with, new grads in Japan, there's more of this thought about the long term around how do I make a life for myself that is fulfilling, and I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm gonna do something just because it's always been done this way, whether that is speaking formally or, you know, maybe even staying with the company for many years. I think there are people who, there are people who have been with ZEALS since its inception for the last 10 years, and people who I think will be with ZEALS 10 years from now. I think that the idea of like the new salaryman um, is a fascinating one. And I think that there may be a little bit more movement between companies in Japanese, AI related efforts that would seem just faster than what we would have expected of the salarymen of like the 80s.
Yeah, you might stay true to a belief system. So you might change from brand to brand, but you stay within your set of beliefs. We're
Yeah,
kind of getting to the end, so I'm gonna shoot a few
sure.
questions at you that we're just
Okay.
gonna answer quickly. And I
Yeah.
think one we kind of went over here. What do you done now currently when you're hiring? What do you look for in a strong team member? What's the one thing that you want?
I think the first thing that I look for is someone who asks questions. I think my experience over the last 2 or 3 years in generative AI is there's a lot of people who come in saying things are like this, things are like that, and, I probe a little bit deeper and the understanding of the knowledge isn't necessarily there. Um, that's not what I look for in a team member. I look for, I will be the first person to say I don't know a thing because I just don't like to claim that I know something when I don't. But I think that it just makes work harder when I work with people who say, "Yeah, I know this," and they come in and then they don't. So rather than that, I like to have team members who will ask for help and say, "I don't know this thing. How do I do this?" We all have things that we know and that we're strong in. We all have things that we can improve upon and don't know. And I think being transparent and genuine about what you don't know and what you can improve on, I think that just helps everybody. So that's the first thing that I look for. And then I think the second thing would just be that methodological rigor. So, okay, we're going to switch models and that's fine. I'm like, did you test the prompt on how many clients data worth of data did you test it on? Oh, you tested on one utterance for 5 clients. I don't know. So yeah, that kind of rigor.
That's interesting. Is that possibly also the hardest skill set to find, or is that something else that you're kind of looking for?
In my role, the hardest skill set to find is someone who can do those things and also speak in English and Japanese. That's the thing. Oftentimes, I can find it in one or another, and finding someone who can speak both languages and also do those things is rare.
Yeah.
But
You
we've
need to
got
build you need to build an agent for that. Yeah.
yeah. I'm like, all right, cool, Claude. Well, what do we do?
We All right, now let's talk about, 1 year. We've been doing this for a while. What is a belief about conversational AI that you have changed going out, or where you changed your mind in the last year?
Changed. Hmm, that's a good one. Uh,
So I'll tell you, for me, it's like
yeah.
evolution versus paradigm shift. Where
Yeah.
I thought it was an evolution that current providers would bring all these LLMs to the
Mm,
market, where actually there's a whole new industry with new conversational AI companies that are LLM first, and it is a significant paradigm shift.
mm.
I think it's my thing.
I think maybe the thing for me is around sort of oversight and regulation, because I think a lot of and I understand the perspective when a lot of people say the regulating kind of stifles creativity. Um, I can certainly understand that from a technological development perspective. As someone who has developed solutions, having to follow all these extra rules, the part of me that's a technologist is not a fan of GDPR. The part of me that is a human and a citizen of the world is. And so I think the speed at which I think I see things evolving, I found myself slightly more hoping for some sort of guardrails of some kind, just because things are moving so fast. I don't know necessarily if government is the exact answer to that, but I find myself maybe that's the biggest sort of shift or change that I'm experiencing for myself is I'm like, maybe we should be a little bit more we should think a little bit more about the consequences of what this is gonna be like.
Yeah. So it's moved faster than you expected, and it's showing more vulnerability than you expected. So, what are we gonna do about that? And then, yeah, looking forward, last question of the day. Um, strategically, next 6 months, like, what's something that you're gonna be focused on?
I think probably the biggest thing I'll be focused on is prompt engineering in Japanese. That's what I've just been so fixated on lately is how do I convey these things that I already know how to do in English? And, I know the English linguistics around what I can convey in a prompt to make it the strongest in a prompt. I have ideas about how that can work in Japanese, but I want to take that even further and get a little bit more detailed because there's certain things that you can do in Japanese that you just can't do in English. So I think that's the main thing, and then secondarily to that, my sort of other side obsession these days with LLMs is prompt engineering for different types of modalities. So, the way I approach prompt engineering for generating text versus generating images versus generating sound is completely different, and thinking about why those are different and how I pull different linguistic levers depending on the output, I've just been super interested in that.
It's interesting. Yeah. So I'm terrible at images and any because I simply do not have the language
Mm,
image. So when I talk to designers, like they'll say in that and that style, I simply don't have the vocabulary to talk
yeah,
about images, and that's where I
yeah,
feel so capped. And that's I guess what I also notice is when a lot of time in a debate, if like will LLMs replace designers? It's like
yeah.
if you don't know what design, if this is your understanding of design, yes, quite easily. But did you know that you can operate up here? And there's
Oh, yeah.
people that really understand the nuance and the impact proper design can have. Kind of what you're talking about. What are we trying to
Yeah.
achieve? How do we use language to get people there? Yeah,
You
that's
know
a whole other level.
Now that you mention this, I actually think maybe I wanna redo my response to your question about what, like, opinion of mine or viewpoint of mine in conversation has changed. Because as you mentioned this, the thing that comes to mind for me that I've been really fixated on the last 6 months is this concept of taste. So, when the former head of design at Salesforce, Justin McGuire, he put together a tiger team to work on Slack, he called us the taste makers, and at the time, I was like, okay, that's interesting. It feels a little squishy for me as a person who's, more of a researcher type. But now, 3 or 4 years later, I've been thinking about it and I'm like, okay, what does it really mean to have taste? It means to have a standard. It means to be able to say, I think this is good and this is bad for these reasons. I like this for these reasons. I don't like this for these other reasons. And when you talk about like generating images, for example, or even generating language, design, I think fundamentally the best design is based on some kind of standard, some kind of taste where you think this is good and this is not. And so I think that's actually maybe the thing that I've sort of shifted a little bit lately is that I used to be, I think I still am to a great degree, very kind of methodical about the scientific rigor around doing something from a research perspective. But now I think I'm become a little bit more comfortable with this sort of squishy, more feely type quality of taste. And that I think that the best designers of experience, whether that is conversation or image or sound, have a bar of quality, are not afraid to say, I think this is good enough or that's not good enough. And therefore they have taste. That I think is the biggest thing.
I really like using that word taste. It makes a lot of sense. I think fundamentally your conversation. I said like you need to think about what is this thing and what do you want it to do and how do you want it to interact with your customers.
And why?
That's and why. And then whether you script that or whether it doesn't
Yes.
matter. Like what are the words going out of the system and what is it doing? And it requires a lot of understanding, skill set to get to that level. But yeah, somebody that doesn't understand, they just see words. So for
Exactly.
them, if you're an engineer, you're building a bot, words come out, oh, that's about what we mean, and problem solve. But then you enter the world of
Yes.
taste, and it's the same as like good writers or editors.
Yes.
Like if you think
Oh,
there's
yeah.
a manuscript, you can just look at the page and say it's bad. Somehow, yeah, there's just like you like whether it's
Because they have a
writing,
standard. Yeah.
it's like boom, you immediately spot like on the first sentence, first paragraph in a manuscript, this is bad. And I've
Yeah.
done very many bad manuscripts, so I know I
But
know
I
what
think that's
manuscripts
also
are doing.
important thing is that I think we need to also be comfortable with and accepting of the fact that we can and should make like poor quality things, but that we improve from there rather than just like, oh, I ticked the box and therefore I did it. That it's okay to make crappy things, but then you evolve.
Yeah, and again, and I guess it then comes back to that same problem that will not go away. It's just because people can speak, they do not understand. It's
Yes.
like the fish in the water. You
Yeah.
don't know what
Yeah.
you don't know what communication is. You don't recognize, but to actually deconstruct that and then apply those things
Yes.
very deliberately to get a certain outcome, that is the skill set. But yeah, everybody could speak, so therefore it's just words, and I think
Yeah.
that's what we as an industry need to figure out how and that's keep explaining ourselves in a
Yes.
humble and new way,
Yes.
reinventing ourselves, moving from conversation design to agentic experience design,
Yes.
reinventing those principles that have been around for centuries.
Yeah, and mentoring a whole new group of tastemakers.
God, we're that old. We're
I know.
entering tastemakers. I love
Oh,
it.
yeah.
Let's put it on a t-shirt.
Oh, yeah.
We're
Let's
gonna
put on a t-shirt that will help my joints, cause ooh, age, man.
Thank you so much, Greg. This is quite
Thank you,
wonderful. That
Hans.
was a great this felt like catching up and interviewing, and I feel like
Yes.
we should just do a quarterly hour of catching up with you for
Yeah.
linguistics.
Yeah, and philosophy and literature, and I mean, I love having these conversations with you. It's great.
We should do that more often. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Thank you everybody for listening and watching. All right.
All right.